Tonight, it may be the most important story in American politics that nobody is talking about, but we are this evening. Trump's family tax scheme, allegations of major fraud, and the Times report on how the president's family managed to skip out on more than $450 million in inheritance taxes. Tonight, we'll speak with one of the reporters who put this 18-month investigation report together. Then, Trump and Kavanaugh, how the court will respond to its newest ultra-conservative member and the lies the president told at his swearing-in and elsewhere. We'll play the audio and give you the reality. And later, no margin for error. The Yankee season on the line tonight after the fiasco last night in the Bronx. We'll take you to the house that Ruth built, or the new one, at least for a pregame report. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. By the way, if I sound bitter, it's because I watched that fiasco firsthand last night. Okay, on to developments today. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. She shocked many today by announcing that she will be leaving effective at the end of this December. The announcement, it caught everybody off guard seemingly, including White House staffers and even Haley's team at the UN. The ambassador saying it had been in the works for months, adding that after 8 straight years in government, 6 as governor of South Carolina and 2 at the UN, she just wanted to step aside. But there's also been talk about the unusual timing of the announcement. Weeks before the midterms, nearly 3 full months ahead of her actual resignation. Now, we're going to be tracking this story in the days to come here, and if there are any updates, trust us, we will bring them to you. Now, that brings us proudly to our top story tonight. More insight from the New York Times deep dive into Trump's family taxes. Now, the story broke here, but you had Kavanaugh and everything else. This is a seismic story that didn't get the play that really it should. Now, this story shows that Trump is not even a semblance of this self-made man that he purports to be, despite the claims to the contrary. It also gets into a lot of the family dynamics, including Donald trying to change his father's will while his dad was near death, and perhaps most importantly, how Trump consciously coordinated to avoid paying millions and millions and millions of taxes. The headline of the Times piece says it all. Trump engaged in suspect tax schemes as he reaped riches from his father. And here's the first line. President Trump participated in dubious tax schemes during the 90s, including instances of outright fraud that greatly increased the fortune he received from his parents. It goes on to detail a, quote, pattern of deception and obfuscation that went way beyond just exploiting legal loopholes. It also prevented the IRS from taxing transfers of wealth to Trump and his siblings. And there's a lot more. Here another portion of the piece. Quote, Mr. Trump received the equivalent of today of at least, get this, $413 million from his father's real estate empire, starting when he was a toddler and continuing to this day. Much of this money came to Mr. Trump because he helped his parents dodge taxes. He and his siblings set up a sham corporation to disguise millions of dollars in gifts from their parents. Records and interviews show. Records also indicate that Mr. Trump helped his father take improper tax deductions worth millions more. He also helped formulate a strategy to undervalue his parents' real estate holdings by hundreds of millions of dollars on tax returns, sharply reducing the bill to Uncle Sam when those properties were transferred to him and his siblings. It is a huge and important story, but one that most of the media seems to have sped on by. That's because this all dropped in the middle of Kavanaugh week. And except for a few hours early last week, it got scant attention during the Supreme Court shuffle. In fact, on this week's Sunday morning shows, none of them focused on the Times tax story. But we are tonight. And for more, we turn to one of the people who wrote that piece, New York Times investigative reporter Russell Bootner. I think I speak for a lot of lifelong New Yorkers who knew that there was always a hustle element when it came to Trump. But I'm curious even from yourself, and I mean even a cursory conversation with anyone that was in the real estate industry, and they'd shake their head at either the inflated value or amount that Donald Trump attached to his net worth, or that he was a pull himself up from the bootstraps kind of guy. Did you anticipate from the beginning of the investigation to what you found at the end just how unbelievably inflated that myth in actuality was?
I don't think we could have. I think you're right. He's been so effective at creating this image of himself, and it's really been central to the money that he's made is just that idea that he's self-made, that everything he did on his own. We here in New York knew a little bit about his father, but he had also been very effective at diminishing his father's accomplishments. So you came to believe that his father owned a few small buildings somewhere in Brooklyn or Queens and did okay, but wasn't wealthy. And yeah, we could have never imagined that Fred Trump would have a year in 1990 when he paid himself $50 million. That was a shock to all of us.
And there's a point in the campaign, we showed the clip where he said, hey, my old man lent me $1 million and I had to pay him back in interest. In your reporting, you say over the lifetime here, at a present-day value, in effect, $413 million was funneled to the Donald from his family's business, specifically his father. Explain how that really started from when he was a toddler.
It started when Donald Trump was 3 years old. His father had just completed his first really big apartment complexes, Beach Haven and Shore Haven, and he gave the land under those buildings to a trust that was for the benefit of his children, and then he began paying them rent. And that was the equivalent of about $200,000 a year from the time Donald Trump was 3 years old. It was basically a physician's salary at the time. And that was just the first mechanism. It grew from there.
One of those threads that you uncover in your reporting is all-county building. Explain what it was set up to do, but what in actuality it really did do.
Sure. All-county is an entity that existed only on paper. The way things worked was Fred Trump continued to negotiate the prices for the goods and services he bought. And instead of the invoice coming from him for those, he had one of his employees create some paperwork to suggest this entity, All County, was buying it. And then he would have All County bill him for 20 to 50% more than what the goods or services actually cost. And then that money, that pad on the invoices, was just distributed to his children. It had no employees. It served no purpose other than to take basically the profits from his building and transfer it to his children without any gift or estate taxes.
One of the other threads that we heard from as candidate to now was, how he was sick about the government helping out people that really should help themselves, etc. Both father and son took advantage of tax subsidies here, or federal subsidies, as it relates to their buildings. And as you uncovered in the reporting, they actually, in many ways, ended up screwing over some of the tenants here by raising the rents while they were padding their own pockets.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, one of the sort of insidious effects of All County was that in order to get a rent increase on rent-regulated apartments, you have to present the bills for what you spent on those units to state regulators. And then based on how much you've spent, they will allow you to raise the rent a certain percentage of that. So they were submitted these inflated bills from All County, and in effect, the tenants were getting rent increases that were 20 to 50% higher than they should have been, just so Donald Trump and his siblings could get a little bit more of their father's wealth.
One of the other narratives that came out was that the Donald was the deal maker, that he was a business savant. He knew how to make things work. When you go through the reporting, you're struck by how many times Fred had to bail out Donald. There was that really, I think, visual story where he literally bought $3.5 million in chips to keep his casino afloat. But that's hardly the only example, right?
No, I mean, this was a trend throughout his career. He really financed all of Donald Trump's start in business. He gave him the loans to get all of his construction projects going. And when Donald Trump hit his toughest time at the end of the 1980s, Fred Trump was funneling tens of millions of dollars to him, sometimes in ways that appear to be illegal if taxing authorities would have ever figured out what was happening. And then Donald Trump began taking the profits along with his siblings from his father's building that kind of really bankrolled him in the 1990s, which was still a low period for him. And they took control of his father's empire in late 1997, and he was suddenly enormously wealthy again just because of that. That happened about 3 weeks before The Art of the Comeback was released.
I want to come back to the final chapter of his father's life. He's ailing, and Donald's still having his own financial challenges despite the many rescues from the father. He tries to rewrite the will without any knowledge given to his other siblings. And he literally, as an attorney with a codicil, go to his father's bedside to try and have him sign away basically his estate to Donald, I think with Donald's intended discretion. Father realizes this, gets Donald's sister, who's now federal judge, involved here to make sure that wasn't the case. Talk about both that scene, but also the idea, it seemed as if that Fred was intending for his empire to be carried on after his death by Donald, but they sold everything off. What was Trump trying to do as it relates to his father's estate?
Well, that was, again, Donald Trump's darkest hour financially in 1990 when that occurred, and you recounted it perfectly. The intent there, the way his father perceived it, was Donald wanted more control over his father's empire, and he wanted the money from that faster and at a greater rate than his siblings would get. The way his father's concern was that all these creditors were knocking down Donald Trump's doors and threatening forced bankruptcies and foreclosures, and that would expose Fred Trump's empire to whatever action those creditors took. We have seen in notes from lawyers that were involved in drafting the wills that Fred Trump's desire was that his empire be kept together, intact, and fund future generations of Trumps. It was very low debt. They had almost no debt on the properties at all, and it was kicking off increasing profits every year. But yes, you're right. They took the buildings through a trust in 1995 through 1997. Then when Fred Trump passed away in June of 1999, he owned very little of what he had built. Shortly thereafter, well, I guess it was 5 years after, Donald Trump was at a meeting with his siblings and the lawyers that handled those properties, and he said, I think it's time to sell. And they arranged a very quiet private sale and sold off the entire empire that their father had hoped would be kept together. And that generated about $177 million in one day for Donald Trump.
You know, Russ, I thought it was very telling that the White House did not dismiss it, called fake news, the reporting, et cetera. They called it, I think, long and boring, and they said the IRS had already looked into it, and there was no there. Speak to that last point first. Did the IRS, in fact, say any such thing? And as I understand it, you've got the New York regulators already looking into this. I know there's no criminal exposure because of statute of limitations, but there could still be real civil penalties and also clawbacks, right?
That's right, Richard. We have no indication that the IRS was ever aware of what All County really was, that they ever took a hard look at that. There are other deals in this we raised questions about that we have no suggestion the IRS ever looked at for what they were. The IRS did look at some of the gift tax returns and the estate tax returns. We don't think they saw the whole picture. We've been told that's pretty common. They do a cursory look at the values that are put on properties, but they don't compare it to other things as we did. They don't really critically analyze those appraisals. And so they did come back and suggest that they told the Trumps they needed to pay more. So there was some review of that, but we just don't think that it was in depth. But you're right, there is a statute of limitation for criminal charges, but if there's fraud involved, civil actions, giving them a tax bill that would reflect the amount any taxing authority think they underpaid, and possibly penalties, are still a possibility. And we don't know if the IRS is going to do anything on this. Seems unlikely under the guidance of President Trump, but New York State and New York City have opened inquiries to see if there are back taxes and penalties that could be assessed based on this.
It's amazing the scope of data with the returns and the tax documents you got. What else was out there that you guys didn't get? Is there still even more to this story that we still don't know? I know that you have an open ask that if somebody has more returns, please send them your way. How much more potentially could there still be that we don't know yet?
It's always hard to tell what you don't know. You know, we have very detailed reports for windows of time where we can tell with very granular detail what happened. There are other windows of time where we don't have such a great view. We think we've sort of like rewritten the financial biography of the president in this effort, but there's just a lot more that we don't know. And especially if you consider the period from about 2005 when these properties were fully liquidated, his father's properties, and now his business has very much changed since then. He was spending cash that we really don't know where it came from, And so all of that is still very much, open for a serious investigation.
And of course, with the Mueller probe, who knows when it comes out of that with some of the additional reporting that may even supplement some of this. Honestly, it was some of the most fascinating reading. I had heard in another interview he had to read tax code books 2 times over. I'm sorry for you, but nonetheless, we all got an education through this whole process. Finally, my question is, separate all the morality out of this, Russ. Were you struck more by how systemic this thing was for over 65 years, or were you more struck just the clever avoidance as it relates to it and how intentional they had to be to set up all these shells, in effect, to make this work for so long?
Wow, do I really have to pick between those two things? I was struck by both of them. I think the amount of money was very striking. And then again, just the various ways that Fred Trump found, some of which other rich people find as well, some of which he seems to have been fairly unique at, to transfer money to his children outside of that gift and estate tax system. We found almost 300 separate streams of wealth that he arranged from the time he was a relatively young man until his death to get money to his children.
Well, it's phenomenal reporting, and I know the Times has done a reprint of it since when it came out. We had the whole Kavanaugh story, and some people may have missed it. I cannot encourage enough for people to give this a read again. Russ, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And up next, quite a day for the president yesterday. Well, when isn't, I suppose. 3 separate events, 3 sets of whoppers on the Kavanaugh confirmation, police tactics, and an example of just plain hypocrisy, airplane hypocrisy. We'll explain and dissect straight ahead.